In this example, we want to look at a study on bone density. So it says that because colas tend to replace healthier beverages and they contain caffeine and phosphoric acid, this researcher wanted to know whether the amount of cola consumed could be associated with a lower bone mineral density in women. So we're going to look at a table that gives you the number of colas consumed during a week and the measure of the femoral neck bone, the density of this particular bone. This is the femoral neck bone is the part of the thigh bone that kind of attaches inside of your hip. So it's kind of that ball and socket ideal right there. So they measure the neck of that particular bone right before you get to the ball part of your thigh bone. And what they're looking at then is the number of colas that were consumed in a week and the density of that particular bone in 15 different women. So here is the data that we have in StatCrunch. You can see the two columns here on the screen. And remember that when I want to create not only a scatter plot but a correlation coefficient, I'm going to go to Stat, Regression, Simple Linear. We're going to let the explanatory variable or the x variable be the colas consumed, and the response or y variable would be the density, the bone density. Click Compute. Let's verify that we have a scatter plot that is linear in nature, and we can see here that our dots are falling in some sort of a linear fashion, and we would say that this is a negative linear relationship. Now the line, again, we're going to ignore the line for this section, but the line is definitely helping us envision that this is all kind of moving in that linear path. It's falling as we move from the left to the right. Moving back a screen, we can identify the correlation coefficient as a negative, which corresponds to the screen we saw just a moment ago, the scatter plot. And we can also identify that the value of the correlation coefficient is a negative 0.806. So that would indicate, again, we're moving a little bit further away from the -1, but we might have some sort of moderately strong relationship between cola consumption and bone density. So here are the results from our StatCrunch data. You'll notice the scatter plot over here along with our calculations for the correlation coefficient. One other way we've already discussed that we can identify whether or not this relationship exists between these two quantitative variables is to use the critical values for our sample size. Seeing here on our screen, we notice that the sample size was 15 women. Using my table of critical values, I scroll down to a sample of 15, and its corresponding critical values 0.514. As we stated before, the absolute value of my R, which would be a 0.806, because absolute values are always positive, so 0.806 is obviously greater than the critical value of 0.514. That's going to help us to conclude then that the increased cola consumption is associated with a lower bone density. Now notice this word here, associated. We've got a little wiggle room in that word, and that's because if we look back at the study that was performed, it was a cohort study. That's an observational study, and we learned back in a previous chapter that when we have observational studies, the only type of conclusion we can make is that there is an association between the variables that we are looking at. So this is going to lead us into an increased cola consumption associated with a lower bone density. One other aspect that I want y'all to remember from when we studied observational studies and the likes in chapter 1 are lurking variables. So in this particular study, lurking variables that could have confounded the results or impacted the results might be things like the age of the women that participated, their BMI or body mass index, maybe their height, whether they smoked, how much average daily intake they had for alcohol, how much calcium was in their diet, were they consumers of caffeine, were they doing any physical activity, were they in menopause. Any of those things could have confounded the results of this study. So we can just say in this case that there is an association between an increased cola consumption and lower bone density.